All right, guys, we're going to talk about how to prevent this, but here's a situation where the pilot lands, has a very minor bounce that turns into a crash because they end up going around and they basically lose control of the airplane. They stall on the go around. Fortunately, the pilot walked away, but this could have been avoided.
Go-arounds are not an emergency. People treat them as such, and they kind of do things very quickly as if the airplane's on fire. But listen, all you're doing is just continuing flying. People kind of have that habit of, if I'm going around, I can't touch the runway, I got to get up. Listen, the runway is meant for an airplane. There's nothing that says you can't go around and touch the runway. So I see people kind of yanking back when they're going around. It's like, hey, it's not a big deal if the airplane settles on the runway. You can settle on the runway. You could stay on the runway while you give yourself that takeoff power, you reduce a notch of flaps, and you're still on the runway. That's not a big deal. I'd much rather the airplane settle on the runway than you violently pitch up and close to stall at a 45-degree angle.
All right, guys, here's what a normal go-around should look like. You bounce, you slowly increase the throttle, carpet off, readjust the trim, flaps retract them if you have them, and then you're on your way to try again.
What I want to talk a little bit about today is go-arounds and kind of the risks associated with them. And I figure the best way to kind of go about that and talk about the risks are to look at accidents, case studies, if you will. Now, I have a whole bunch of accident reports here, and I'm not going to go through them individually and kind of read them out and talk about the pilot's background and stuff. There's plenty of accounts on YouTube that do a great job of the accident analysis. It's not what I'm going to do, but I'm going to read off pretty important parts of a whole bunch of accident reports, and you guys will kind of see some of the same things kind of pop up in every accident. So those we can kind of highlight and call those the talking points, if you will, because they're really similar across all the accidents. And I'm not going to talk too much about the pilot's experience, because in a lot of these cases, some of them are students, some of them have, a couple thousand hours. And I think it's important to remember that no matter how much time and experience you have, all of us could end up in one of these accidents reports because we're human. We all make mistakes, right? But identifying these mistakes and working on them, I think, is important to become a better, safer pilot. So that's what I'm going to do. So in the first video that you guys saw when I first started this video, you saw a 172 make not really a bad landing, but it bounced a little bit, and they go around, they pitch up, they end up stalling the airplane and crashing. Well, that actually hits pretty close to home, because that's one of the first airports that I went to, Old Bridge, New Jersey, which is not far from here at all. And it was a student pilot on, I believe, one of their first, if not their first, solo. Pilot walked away, they're fine. I don't know if they came back to flying, but it's important because you'll see this kind of same thing happen in a whole bunch of accidents, and I'll touch on them in a minute. But the pilot lands, and it's not a bad landing. It's a little bit of a bounce, which kind of turns into maybe a little bit more of a pilot-induced bouncing or oscillations, if you will. They go full power. The flaps are still down. The airplane is trimmed for landing, so the airplane pitches up, and what happens, obviously, is they pitch up to 20, 30, 40 degrees, whatever it is, and the airplane stalls. And that's what happened in this case here. All of these things kind of happen again and again and again because we're all human, we're all capable of making mistakes, but identifying these mistakes, or threats as we call them in the airlines, we call it threat error management. Identify the threat, kind of figure out how you can kind of attack the threat and have a successful outcome in whatever the case may be, whether it's an emergency, a failure, in this case, a go-around. The threat for a go-around is obviously stalling the airplane or getting the airplane in an undesired aircraft state. So I'm going to read through some of these. I'll just kind of read through or the highlighted parts of the narrative, and you'll see after reading 3 or 4 of these, there's a couple common things that pop up, and we'll talk about that, and then I'll show you the video in the Cub on how we can kind of combat those situations and kind of avoid getting ourselves into those situations to begin with. So the first one we'll take a look at was a Mooney, okay, and this is a perfect example. Witness observed the airplane touch down about midfield and began to porpoise. Should just go around initially, but they try to save it, and that's kind of where things get out of hand, right? So alternately bouncing between the main and the nose landing gear. After 3 to 4 oscillations, the pilot initiated a go around, and reported to the controller of the go-around. The airplane climbed a few hundred feet and then was observed to enter a very steep left bank. The nose pitched sharply down. The aircraft descended. Obviously, they stalled and crashed the airplane. So that's one scenario. Pilot bounces the airplane 4 or 5 times, then initiates the go-around, stalls the airplane. So some of the things that we see, number one, unstable approach because they landed halfway down the runway. They tried to salvage a poor landing. They bounced 3 or 4 times, and then they initiated a go-around. And then the last threat is when they increase power to go around, they obviously pitch the aircraft to a state where it exceeds the critical angle of attack and the airplane stalls.
Right, so first thing we'll talk about is just the bounce landing recovery, because I've seen, and I've been guilty of this too, is you bounce the landing and then people tend to just panic. Remember, a go-around is not an emergency, all right? It's just simply smoothly and authoritatively, applying power, getting the airplane flying again under directional control, carb heat off if you happen to have carb heat, and then you want to reduce the flaps to usually just one notch retracted from where you were for your landing, essentially to a takeoff position. And then once you have a positive rate of climb, and you're under control, then you want to go ahead and not retract the gear. And again, this is all dependent upon your POH. I don't have flaps, but it's essentially the same thing. And, that's kind of an interesting point, because the important thing is getting the airplane flying again, not so much the flaps and the gear. All right, so let's say you're coming in, normal approach and landing, and you make kind of a rough landing and you bounce. Just really, really simple recovery. Alright, so I'm coming in and I bounce the airplane, right? Okay, big bounce. Slowly apply power. Get the airplane flying again. Carb heat off. Reduce 1 notch of flaps. Positive rate. Gear up, and you're on your way. It's not a big deal. It's not an emergency. And also another thing too, and I'll demonstrate this later, is when you apply power, smoothly apply power. The airplane's already flying. Just don't load up the wing. Don't yank back to get off the ground, and you'll have no problems. And another thing too is if you settle back on the runway, it's not a big deal at all. I mean, it's a runway. That's what it's for. So I'll demonstrate another go around here where I wait a little bit too long to add power, and the airplane settles back on the runway. Again, it's not a big deal at all. I mean, that's what the runway's for.
So in this case here, I add the throttle just a little bit late, and I settle back down on the runway, but it's not a big deal. I mean, it's almost like a touch and go, and then you just continue on your way and try again.
So here we are, bounced the landing, a little slow to recover. I settle back on the runway. It's not a big deal. That's what the runway's for. Just bleed off just a little bit of airspeed. All right, so here we are coming in. Let's see, I bounced the landing. I don't like it. I'm gonna go around, release some of the back pressure. I'm on the runway, it's not a big deal. Positive control, airplane's in the climb. Throttle, or excuse me, carb heat off, throttle full, readjust trim, flaps, reduce it to takeoff flap setting, positive rate, gear up. It's not a big deal. It's not an emergency.
This one is another Mooney, actually. Flight instructor stated that the airplane landed hard, bounced, and the pilot receiving the instruction initiated a go-around at a high pitch attitude. The airplane yawed to the left, remember that, and settled onto the runway, veered off the runway, hit a couple taxi lights, the gear collapsed, both walked away. But a couple things. Pitch attitude here, and then also the yawing to the left. So just keep that in mind. All right, here's one with a PA-24-260, and that I believe is a Piper Comanche, and I think this model had around 300 horsepower. So a significant amount of power, heavier airplane. A witness heard squealing and the sound of screeching tires. He looked toward the runway and saw the airplane bouncing out of control. Again, pilot-induced oscillations. He reported that the airplane then went full throttle and pitched the nose up to approximately 45 degrees, and it started climbing. Next thing you know, they see the airplane crashing into trees off the end of the runway. Another common theme here, squealing, screeching tires, airplane bouncing out of control, and then the aircraft pitching up 45 degrees. So we see initially what seems to be the past 3 accidents, a couple bounces, and then finally they decide to go around and the aircraft pitches up to 45 degrees. Now this one is on a 170 and this one's a tail dragger. So bouncing a tail dragger is a little bit different, and the reason being is the center of gravity on a tail dragger is behind the mains. So a nose gear airplane, if you hit hard, when you hit, the nose kind of drops down, right? Tail dragger, when you hit hard, the center of gravity is behind the main, so what happens? The tail hits hard. Well, when the tail hits hard, what happens to the angle of attack on the wing? It increases, so the airplane pitches up, and then, you know, the pilot, if they panic, they go forward on the stick. So then you have the aerodynamic forces of you going forward on the stick along with gravity, and then you're diving back down on the runway, and then you panic and you pull back, and you kind of start this really, really weird pilot-induced oscillations, and that's where things can get really, really ugly.
Perfect example of pilot oscillations. You hit and then you start yanking on the stick up and down, and this is the end result.
So anyway, in this case, pulled back to bleed off airspeed. The ground was closer than the pilot expected, and the airplane bounced during the subsequent landing. The pilot continued the landing, lost directional control, and the airplane bounced again. He attempted to abort the landing using rudder input to try and regain directional control, but the airplane veered off the runway to the left. Again, multiple bounces before the pilot decided to go around. I've done that. I'm guilty of it. So it's not an uncommon thing, but it's just kind of something to keep in mind. So far, all of these accidents all happened after the second, third, sometimes fourth attempt, right? It's never just been the initial bounce and they went around. So that's kind of a theme that keeps popping up. And I'll kind of do one more here because they're kind of all, you see, they're kind of all have very similar things. At this point, I think you guys could identify some of the common themes that keep popping up. Let's see. All right, here's one. Piper PA-28, I believe it's Cherokee. Just before touchdown, the right wing lifted and the airplane drifted left. So this drifting to the left kind of seems to be a little bit of a theme. He applied power to go around, but the stall warning activated and the airplane continued to drift left. Subsequently, the airplane aerodynamically stalled and collided with the ground and airport taxiway sign. In this case, the winds were like 270 at 6 knots, and there was landing runway 23, so not much of wind. But some of the common themes that you'll read in these reports, and these are actually great reports just to go and read all these, because this is kind of how you learn, is you identify things that keep happening, because if they happen to one pilot, they're going to happen to multiple pilots. So anyway, some of the things that you see is, number one, if you're approaching the runway and you get a gust of wind or anything that kind of throws you off a little bit, you don't need to continue the approach, right? Unless you're on fire or the engine quit because you're running out of gas, just go ahead and try again. There's been many times in my local airport where it was gusty winds and I would come in and it was gusty and I would say, you know what, let me try again and see if I can get, you know, a little bit of a lull in the wind. So that's the first thing. If you're not stable or the wind is a little bit too gusty, just go around and try again. The other thing is try not to salvage a poor landing. A lot of these accidents during the first bounce, if they just went around, probably would have been, it certainly would have been better than what happened, right? So in a lot of these, once you're past your second, third, fourth bounce, it's time to just give it up and just go around. I'm more of a one bounce guy. I'll try to salvage it on one bounce, and I'll kind of talk about how to salvage an approach, at least in a tail dragger, if you bounce once. But once you start bouncing 2-3 times, there's really a point of diminishing returns, and it's after that second bounce. So just go and try it again. So that's the one thing that we see, right, is they keep bouncing, and then they finally decide to go around, and at that point, they're 3/4 of the way down the runway. They're probably flustered. The adrenaline's going, so that's no good. And the next thing, which you'll see, and this is, I had to learn the hard way, story time. When I first started flying, I had an instructor who told me, hey, this airplane has 40 degrees of flaps. There's a lot of flight control pressure. So when you're coming into landing, trim the airplane all the way so that you kind of have hands free and the airplane's nice and pitched for, you know, a nice stabilized 65 knot approach, whatever it was. Problem with that is when you go around and you go full power, especially with 40 degrees of flaps, the airplane is going to pitch up aggressively. And if you're not ready for it, it's going to bite you, like it has in a few of these accidents. One of them, they said the airplane pitched up to 45 degrees.
The personal preference, I always like to have a little bit of feedback in the stick. But I'll have it here now, where I'll set the trim for, you know, really, really nose high. And this will be even more pronounced if you have flaps. Unfortunately, in the Cub, I don't. But watch what happens, hands off, on a go-around, with the trim set to have very, very light controls with full flaps. And some airplanes, like some of the older 172s, you know, have 40 degrees of flaps, and that's a big deal. The airplane is going to pitch up significantly. All right, so trim. Trim is almost full nose up. And you know, feels nice, right? Yeah, it's great until you have to go around. So I'm coming in, let's say there's traffic on the runway, and I go around and watch what happens to the nose. Look at that. Pitches straight up. Look at, really got to push forward on the controls to counteract that. And that could be a big deal. I mean, if you're not expecting it, and you go full throttle, the airplane is going to pitch up significantly.
So there's a couple problems with that, right? Number one, you have obviously all that drag. Number two, you're at a very high angle of attack. Number three, you've got very slow airspeed. And number four, you have a high power setting. Well, in a lot of these accidents, they talk about the airplane veering to the left or turning to the left. Well, that's left turning tendencies, right? And that's going to be more pronounced when you're high angle of attack, high power, low airspeed. So to combat that, obviously, think of it when you're feeding in the power, kind of feed in your foot with the right rudder, kind of anticipate it so you keep tracking straight. And the other thing, and I see this a lot, and this is one of those things where I see it on flight reviews and when I'm instructing, go-arounds are not an emergency. People treat them as such, and they kind of do things very quickly as if the airplane's on fire. I mean, slowly bring in the power, all right? Make sure the aircraft's under control directionally. When you feed in the power, you know, feed in that right rudder. If you have control forces, you got to fight them, right? You can't let the airplane get away from you. Either carb heat or bring flaps up to the takeoff setting or one notch less than what you had it, you know, whatever the book says. And then once you're established and you're climbing out, go ahead and bring the gear up if you have retractable gear, and then go ahead and communicate to ATC. And at the same time, if there's an aircraft in front of you, obviously you want to go to the right side of the runway, or if it's, you know, right-hand traffic, you want to go to the left side of the runway to make sure the airplane is not going to climb into you. But the point is that it's not an emergency. You got to just fly the airplane, right? And that's why when I come in, especially in the Cub, I like to have trim so I can always feel a little bit of the airplane feedback. I can feel what the flight controls are doing. Even if I'm just doing something like looking at a map or, you know, looking at the radio, if I kind of release some of the pressure on the stick, if anything, it's not going to pitch up. It might even pitch a little bit down because I like to have a little bit more nose down trim, if anything. So again, just kind of a technique that I like to use, especially if I'm coming into landing. I have a buddy that's got a Super Cub and he lets me fly it. And when I'm coming into landing, you know, I almost have to pull back a little bit because I have to anticipate if I'm going around with that Super Cub and it's 160 horsepower and all those flaps, it's going to pitch up pretty violently. And, you know, I don't want to have to sit there and be fighting the airplane. So I'd rather have a little help from the airplane. Just a technique that I like to use, but certainly at least be ready for it. Because a lot of times, like I said, and you've seen in these accidents, you go full power, the airplane's going to pitch up dramatically. So that's something you have to be aware of. So that's one thing that we identified that happens a lot. The other one is the airplane drifting, and we kind of talked about that. It's just, you know, as you're feeding the power, go ahead and give yourself right rudder. And also the other thing too about the going around not being an emergency is, you know, you don't have to slam the throttle. I mean, that's not good because the engine, it can quit. The airplane's already flying. Just slowly bring in the power and be on your way. It'll make it a lot less harder for you to control the airplane if you slowly bring in the power. It's a little easier to manage not only the rudder, but the elevator. So those are just kind of some of the things that I've seen on the accident reports that kind of is a recurring theme. And this is also a thing, you know, I tend to go around probably more than I should because, you know, with these flight school airplanes, they fly slightly larger patterns than I do. So I usually turn base where I normally do and then final, and then, you know, they're rolling down to the end of the runway. Obviously I have to go around. In my Cub, it's a lot easier because I don't have flaps. I only have 65 horsepower, so it's pretty manageable, but I do tend to go around a lot, so I've got a lot of practice in it. So I encourage everybody to just, you know, do a couple you know, listen, it gives you more flight time, you know, and the wife's bugging you to say, how come you're not home? And just say, I had to do go around. But in all seriousness, there's nothing wrong with doing a couple practice approaches or practice go-arounds just to kind of, you know, be familiar with it, because I know, you know, when I'm at work, and this is when I've been a captain, a first officer, and on the jump seat, go-arounds on an airliner are always a little bit of a cluster. So, you know, to not do one for 6 months and then doing out on the line, it's always pretty ugly. We do it fine and we can manage it, but it's never pretty. And on the Airbus, you know, it trims for you, so it's you know, it's all hands on deck though in the Airbus, because you can't overspeed the gear, the flaps. There's a lot of things you got to worry about. But the point is, if you don't do these for a couple months, even professionals like myself, it's going to be a cluster. So I encourage you guys to practice this. So yeah, that's pretty much all I got. Another thing too is, you know, when you get to more complex airplanes, the order in which you do things, it's going to be, you know, it's going to be in the POH or the checklist or whatever the case. But when I did my commercial training, and I think for commercial, you don't even need to do it in a complex airplane anymore, which I think is kind of odd. But anyway, when I started flying the 172 Cutlass, the RG, I felt like it was a really cool airplane. It was my first retract. When we did go-arounds, because I was so, you know, excited about having a retractable landing gear, you know, I'd go full power and then I'd immediately go and try to put the gear up, and my instructor would, you know, bat my hand away because we were, you know, 5 feet off the runway. And it's like, listen, the landing gear is not the priority here. The airplane is going to fly fine with the gear down. Make sure you have full power first. You reduce a notch of flaps. You get yourself going, and then you bring the gear up.
Hey, I promised the balanced landing recovery technique, so here it is. All right, balanced landing, or landing from a bounce, right? So in this case, when you bounce the airplane, what I see people tend to do is they tend to pull back on the stick. The problem with that is because the energy from the bouncing, the airplane's going to go up on its own. You don't need to go back on the stick. And what happens is you go back on the stick, as well as the energy of the bounce, and then you panic, and then you go full forward on the stick, along with the gravity and weight of the airplane bringing you back down to earth, and then you basically have two forces bringing you back down to the ground. So then you panic, and then you go back on the stick, and it's kind of this really bad up and down pilot-induced oscillation. All right, a much better way to land from a bounce is really to not do very much at all. Less is more. So here we bounce, the airplane's going to go up, I don't need to help it go up, and eventually the airplane's going to come back down, I don't need to help it come back down. I'll just kind of keep the stick where it is, and as the airplane starts to sink again, I'll slowly bring that stick back to keep it in that 3-point full stall attitude. Maybe I'll give it a touch of power, but really the key here is to just keep the stick back and let the airplane settle down on the runway nicely. So watch the elevator not really do anything until the airplane starts to sink again, and then watch how it slowly comes back. See, that turned out to be actually a really nice landing. But again, don't focus too much on trying to land from a bounce. Really, your priority should be going around. That's all I got for today, guys. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.